A black pilot had spent years proving himself in an industry that never wanted him. But when he stepped into the captain's seat for the first time, everything changed. A senior flight instructor, threatened by his presence, set him up for failure, humiliating him in front of his peers, telling him he'd never be good enough. But just 3 minutes later, the tables turned, the truth about the instructor came out. And what happened next shocked the entire aviation industry, setting off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was supposed to be just another training session. But that day, history was made. Isaiah Walker had been watching the sky since he was a child. Even before he knew what it meant to be a pilot. Before he had ever seen the inside of a cockpit. Before he understood how the world worked and who it worked for. He had known, deep in his bones, that he belonged up there. It was not ambition at first. It was something quieter. A feeling. A calling. But for a boy like him, growing up in a place where dreams were small and practical, where survival often took the place of ambition, saying "I want to fly" felt like stepping into a world that had no intention of making room for him. His father, a truck driver who knew the weight of the road better than the lightness of the sky, never told him outright that his dream was impossible. But he didn't have to. The long pauses, the careful nods, the way he would say, "That's a big dream, son," instead of "You can do it." Those things carried their own kind of gravity. His mother, ever the believer, had been different. "Then fly," she had told him once, when he was no more than 10 years old, pointing up at a plane slicing through the clouds. "Let them tell you no. Then do it anyway." That was the moment he had decided. Not just that he would fly, but that he would fly in a world that would never expect to see him in the cockpit. That realization came in quiet moments. In this way teachers encouraged other boys with lighter skin and lighter names, to apply for aviation programs while steering him toward more realistic careers. In the way, the older men at the barbershop laughed when he mentioned flying, shaking their heads. "They don't let us do that," one had said, not with malice but with certainty. "They'll put you in the back, not in the front." And yet, he pushed forward, not because he wanted to prove them wrong, at least, not entirely, but because the sky had never judged him. The sky had never hesitated before letting him in. It was the world on the ground that was the problem. The first flight. Isaiah worked 2 jobs to pay for flight lessons. At 18, while his friends were saving for cars, for clothes, for college applications, he was saving for airtime. His first flight was in a rickety Cessna. The kind of plane that rattled when the wind shifted too hard. The kind that made you feel the weight of every decision in your hands. The way a real pilot should. His instructor, a middle-aged white man named David, watched him carefully as he took the controls, waiting, expecting the nerves to set in. But Isaiah felt no fear. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. David noticed. "You've done this before?" Isaiah shook his head. "No, but I've been flying for years." David had laughed, not understanding what he meant. But Isaiah did. And that was enough. The first realization. Flying, as it turned out, was the easy part. It was everything that came with it. The glances at the flight school. The questions. The way some instructors seemed to watch him more closely than his peers. Waiting for mistakes. That was the real challenge. He saw it in the little things. Like how some students got called naturals, while he was always told he had to work harder. Like how one instructor hesitated before letting him fly solo, despite his flawless performance. Like how, when he walked into an aviation conference with his flight school badge clipped to his shirt, someone had assumed he was staff. "Excuse me, where's the restroom?" Isaiah had blinked, the words slow to process. He was surrounded by people in flight uniforms, surrounded by young pilots and instructors and recruiters. But they had looked at him and seen something else. It was a mistake. Sure, a small thing. But small things add up. They become heavier with time. And Isaiah had spent his entire life carrying them. The challenge begins. By the time he was accepted into an elite flight academy, Isaiah had learned the rules. He had to be better. Not just good. Not just competent. Flawless. Because for someone like him, one mistake would not be just a mistake. It would be proof. Proof that he didn't belong. Proof that they had been right all along. Proof that people like him were meant to sit in the back, not the front. And so, he trained harder. He memorized emergency procedures in his sleep. He reviewed weather patterns, wind resistance calculations, mechanical failures, every single thing that could go wrong, and how to fix it. Because the world would not give him a second chance. Because the world did not expect him to be here in the first place. But Isaiah did not ask for permission. He had already taken the sky. And soon, they would have no choice but to see him there. Isaiah had learned to expect turbulence. Not just in the air, but in life itself. He had spent years navigating through it, understanding its patterns, knowing when to brace for impact. Because the kind of turbulence he faced was not a sudden, violent shake. It was the slow, constant pull of resistance, a wind that never quite let up, even when the sky seemed clear. And here, in flight school, that resistance took on new forms. It was the way instructors looked at him when he walked into a room, scanning him as if searching for something out of place. It was in the way his fellow trainees, most of them sons of pilots, grandsons of men who had owned the skies before he had ever touched them, spoke about him when they thought he wasn't listening. He's good, but I don't know. I just don't see him as a captain. You know? I mean, he's solid, but would you trust him in a real crisis? They didn't mean for him to hear. But things like that had a way of finding their way to you, no matter how far you tried to rise above them. A lesson in doubt. The first real test came during emergency landing drills. A simulated engine failure, a sharp descent, a race against gravity to bring the aircraft back to the ground safely. Isaiah had prepared for this moment for months. He had studied every variable, memorized every step of the protocol. He was ready, but as he approached the simulator, he saw that Captain Jacobs, one of the lead instructors, was watching him. Jacobs was an old-school pilot, the kind who had been flying since before Isaiah was born. He spoke about the golden age of aviation, about when pilots really knew how to fly, about how the industry had changed, and not always for the better. Isaiah had never heard Jacobs say it outright, but he could see it in the man's eyes. Some people just don't belong in the cockpit. Still, Isaiah stepped inside the simulator. The test began. At first, everything was smooth. The controls responded to his touch. The aircraft obeyed his every move. But then, an alert. Engine failure. The plane was losing altitude. Isaiah's hands moved swiftly, cutting off the damaged engine, adjusting the throttle, calculating descent angles in real time. He was calm. He was in control. And then, just as he was about to make his final approach, Jacobs cut the simulation. Not good enough, he said flatly. Isaiah turned to face him. I followed every protocol. Jacobs nodded, unimpressed. Sure, but your reaction time wasn't instinctive. You hesitated. I followed the emergency checklist, Isaiah replied, his voice steady. Jacobs smirked. Yeah, and that's the problem. He turned to the other trainees. A good pilot doesn't just follow the steps. He feels the plane, anticipates the failure before it happens. Isaiah clenched his jaw, because he knew what this was. The others were allowed to make mistakes. They could take a second too long to react, and it would be called a learning experience. For Isaiah, hesitation was not just a mistake. It was confirmation. Confirmation that he wasn't ready. Confirmation that he wasn't meant to be here. Isaiah wanted to argue, wanted to demand another attempt, to ask why some of the others had been given second chances but he was being shut down after one test. But he knew better, because arguing would not change anything. It would only make them see him the way they expected to see him. Angry, defensive, out of place. So he nodded, and walked out. The Pirate War. That night, he didn't sleep. He went back to the training manuals, memorized every detail of the landing sequence again, over and over, until the numbers blurred in his mind. He reminded himself that he had been here before, that he had spent his entire life outrunning doubt, that he would not stop now. But doubt was a heavy thing. And even when you knew it wasn't yours to carry, it still found a way to sink into your skin. He thought of his mother's words. Let them tell you no. Then do it anyway. So that's what he would do. He would take every rejection, every dismissive look, every stolen opportunity, and turn it into fuel. Because they had given him only one shot. And next time, he would not just pass. He would be undeniable. Isaiah Walker had spent his whole life breaking through walls. Some were made of concrete, others of whispers. Most of them, however, were built in silence, barriers that no one acknowledged but that everyone obeyed. And now, as he sat in the Flight Academy's main hall, staring at the list of names posted for the next round of advanced simulator training, he was faced with another one. His name was not on the list. He had done everything right. Outperformed half the cadets in his class. Put in more training hours. Memorized flight protocols down to the second. He had been better. But here he was. Passed over. Again. The excuse. When he asked for an explanation, he was given one that sounded reasonable on the surface. We're just selecting the cadets who show the most natural leadership in the cockpit. One instructor told him. It's about who has that instinctive command presence. Another added. Isaiah had heard this before. Instinctive meant different things for different people. For his white classmates, it meant confidence. For him, it meant aggression. Command presence was what they saw when his peers made quick decisions, even if they were reckless. When Isaiah did the same, it became hesitation. That was how it worked. He had learned this lesson a long time ago. The rules were the same, but the way they were applied was different. So he did not argue. He just nodded and walked away. The conversation no one wants to have. That night, he sat in his dorm, staring at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to tell someone. But who? His father had spent his whole life swallowing injustice, working long hours without complaint because that was just the way things were. His mother would tell him to keep pushing forward. And his friends, his classmates, well, they didn't see the world the same way he did. You're overthinking it, man. One of them had told him earlier that day when he brought it up. You'll get your shot. Another said. You just have to prove yourself. Prove himself? What had he been doing all this time? Isaiah felt a slow, quiet anger settle in his chest. Not a burst of rage, but something deeper. Because the hardest part of all of this wasn't just the rejection. It was the gaslighting. The way they made him question himself. The way they made him feel like maybe he was overthinking it. Like maybe it was his fault. The challenge he wasn't supposed to take. 2 weeks later, an opportunity came. Not from the academy, but from something bigger. A national aviation competition. An elite event where the best student pilots in the country competed in advanced flight simulations. Handling real-world crisis scenarios in real time. Winning meant more than a trophy. It meant recognition. It meant respect. It meant undeniable proof that he was not just good enough. He was better. He signed up immediately. But when Captain Jacobs found out, he pulled Isaiah aside. You don't need to do this, Jacobs said, leaning against his desk. You're a solid pilot. No one's questioning that. Isaiah knew what this was. It was the same thing they always did. They kept you waiting. Kept telling you to be patient. That your time would come. Not now. Later. Always later. If I don't need to do this, Isaiah said, keeping his voice measured, then why haven't I been given the same opportunities as the others? Jacobs exhaled sharply. You really want to be the guy making this about that? Isaiah's jaw tightened. Because that was the trap. Wasn't it? If he spoke up, he was playing the race card. If he stayed quiet, he was accepting his place. Jacobs sighed, shaking his head. Do what you want, but just remember, there's a difference between a good pilot and a great one. And great pilots know when to wait their turn. Isaiah met his gaze. Great pilots also know when they don't have time to wait. And with that, he walked out. Straight into the competition. Straight into the fight he wasn't supposed to win. The room was cold, not physically, but in the way that certain spaces were designed to remind you that you were somewhere you didn't belong. Isaiah Walker had been in rooms like this before. Classrooms, boardrooms, Flight school debriefings. Places where he was expected to perform. But never to belong. And now, standing in the flight simulator hangar for the National Aviation Competition, surrounded by competitors who did not look like him, he recognized the feeling all over again. The other cadets were talking among themselves. Some shaking hands with instructors they knew. Others laughing in the easy, unbothered way of men who had been raised to believe that the world would always open its doors for them. Isaiah? Isaiah was the only one here who had had to fight just to step inside. The judges were seasoned pilots. Most of them former Air Force, airline captains, industry veterans. They looked at him, and he could feel the question in their eyes before they even said it. Where did this one come from? Isaiah didn't answer. Not with words. He had learned a long time ago that words would never be enough. He would answer with the one thing they could not deny: skill. The rules of the game. The competition was brutal. Each cadet would face 3 flight challenges, simulating real-life emergencies, an engine failure during takeoff, a mid-air stall in severe turbulence, a final landing maneuver under complete instrument failure. It was designed to push pilots to the edge, to test their ability to command an aircraft under extreme pressure. It was also designed to expose who truly belonged in the cockpit and who didn't. Isaiah had trained for this. But training and opportunity were not the same thing. Some of the other cadets had been coached for this competition since childhood. They had flown under mentors who looked like them, had instructors who saw potential in their mistakes rather than failure. Isaiah? Isaiah had taught himself, had studied after hours, alone, had watched hours of flight footage, breaking down every maneuver, memorizing the way the best pilots moved their hands, how they adjusted their instruments, how they thought. He had done it alone. And now, he would do it again. The first test. Isaiah's name was called. He stepped into the simulator cockpit, his fingers running over the controls. The cold metal felt familiar. Grounding. The test began. Engine failure. 2 minutes after takeoff. The alarm blared. The plane lurched. Isaiah reacted instantly. Throttle back. Cut the bad engine. Stabilize. The world outside the screen blurred. Altitude dropping fast. The key wasn't to panic. It wasn't about fighting gravity. It was about working with it. Reading it. Understanding what the plane needed before it needed it. He leveled out. Made the emergency call. Executed the landing. When the simulation ended, he turned to face the judges. They were quiet. No criticism. No notes. Just a curt nod. Isaiah stepped out of the simulator. The next cadet, a tall, blonde trainee from a prestigious flight school, patted him on the shoulder as he passed. Didn't think you'd handle that so clean, he muttered. Isaiah looked at him. Then you weren't paying attention. The second test. The turbulence simulation was next. A mid-air stall, the worst possible situation for any pilot. Isaiah took his seat. The simulator shook violently, simulating high-altitude wind shear. The warning lights flickered. Stall warning. Isaiah's training kicked in. Most pilots, when faced with a stall, pull up. Instinct tells them to climb, to escape. But that was how you lost control. Isaiah pushed forward instead. It was counterintuitive. The kind of maneuver that only worked if you knew exactly when to do it. The simulator's nose dipped. Then, recovery. The plane stabilized. A smooth, controlled return to flight. Outside the simulator, he could hear murmurs. Someone whispered, "Damn, that was a textbook." The lead judge barely looked up from his clipboard. Next. The final test. Isaiah had passed the first 2 challenges. Now comes the hardest part. Complete instrument failure. No working gauges. No autopilot. Just a dark cockpit and pure instinct. He exhaled, gripping the controls. The timer started. He had 3 minutes to land the plane. The thing about flying blind is that you can't rely on what you see. You have to feel the aircraft. Trust its weight. Read the wind through the vibrations in the controls. This was the test that separated good pilots from great ones. Isaiah felt the runway before he saw it. He adjusted for wind drift, slowed his descent, and landed. Smooth. The simulator powered down. The room was silent. Then one of the younger judges leaned forward. Eyes unreadable. Who trained you? Isaiah met his gaze. The sky did. The verdict. The results were posted an hour later. First place. Isaiah Walker. There was no applause. No congratulations. Just an uncomfortable silence. Because some people had not expected him to win. And some had not wanted him to. Captain Jacobs, who had once told him to wait his turn, stared at the results. His mouth was tight, but he forced out a stiff, "Good job." Isaiah said nothing, because he had never needed their validation to know who he was. He walked out of the hangar, head high, the world outside stretching open before him. This was his moment. But the real fight? The real fight was only just beginning. Victory was not the end of the struggle. It never was. Isaiah Walker had learned this a long time ago, when he aced his first aviation exam and still felt the need to prove he belonged. When he landed his first solo flight and was met with quiet skepticism instead of praise. When he walked into the flight school hallways knowing that excellence was never enough. Not for someone like him. Winning the national aviation competition should have changed everything. It should have cemented his place. Should have forced people to acknowledge what he had known all along. That he was one of the best. But change never came easy. Especially when the people in charge had no interest in seeing it happen. The cold reception. The day after his victory. Isaiah returned to the flight academy expecting, if not celebration, at least recognition. Instead, he was met with silence. No congratulations from his instructors. No acknowledgement from his peers. Even the academy's official website made no mention of his win, though they had been quick to highlight past champions. At lunch, he overheard two cadets talking at a nearby table. "I mean, yeah, he won. But those simulator tests don't mean he's ready for the real thing." "Exactly. He's good. But leadership? I don't know, man. Some guys just don't have the right instincts." Instincts. That word again. It was always instincts when it came to him. Never skill. Never discipline. As if no matter how much he proved himself, there would always be some invisible quality. Some unspoken, undefinable thing that they would say he lacked. Isaiah forced himself to stay calm. Because anger, no matter how justified, was never allowed to be just anger when it came from men like him. The meeting. A week later, Isaiah was called into Captain Jacobs' office. The same man who had told him to wait. The same man who had subtly, carefully, tried to keep him from rising too fast. Jacobs didn't look up as Isaiah entered. Just gestured for him to sit. Isaiah didn't. "Let's talk about your future," Jacobs said finally, leaning back in his chair. "You've got talent. No one's questioning that." Isaiah said nothing. "But talent isn't everything," Jacobs continued. "You need to fit the culture. Leadership isn't just about skill. It's about trust, command presence." Isaiah exhaled slowly. There it was. The coded language. Fit the culture. Command presence. Trust. Jacobs wasn't saying Isaiah lacked skill. He couldn't. Not after the competition. But he was saying, in the quiet, careful way that men like him always said things, that Isaiah was still not one of them. That no matter how well he flew, no matter how many trophies or titles he earned, there would always be some unspoken barrier. Some quiet rule that said, "Not yet. Not you." The ultimatum. Then Jacobs made his real point. "You should consider a different track," he said. "Aviation has a lot of opportunities outside the cockpit. Training, operations, even recruitment. We need diversity there more than anywhere." Isaiah's jaw tightened. Diversity. They would always make room for him somewhere. Just not here. They would give him a title. A desk. A place where he could be useful but never powerful. They would keep him close enough to prove they weren't excluding him. But never so close that he could actually change anything. He had seen this before. In sports, where black athletes were praised for their talent but rarely given coaching positions. In business, where men like him could work twice as hard but still watch others climb faster. It was always the same. The illusion of inclusion. Isaiah looked at Jacobs, his mind already made up. "No," he said simply. Jacobs frowned. "You're making this harder on yourself," he warned. "You've got a good career ahead of you. If you don't push too hard. If you don't challenge the system." Isaiah smiled. But what's the point of flying? He said, if you're not willing to go against the wind? And with that, he walked out. The consequence. The backlash came fast. Suddenly, doors that had been open before were closing. He was passed over for flight assignments. Instructors who had once praised his technical skills became critical of small mistakes. Every flight evaluation was scrutinized. Every maneuver questioned. He could feel them waiting. Waiting for him to mess up. Waiting for him to give them an excuse to say, "See, we were right about him." Isaiah didn't give them that excuse. But it didn't matter. Because 1 month later, he was informed that he would not be advancing to the next level of flight training. No clear reason. No formal explanation. Just a quiet, administrative decision. He had won the biggest aviation competition in the country. And now, he was being told he wasn't ready. That was how the system worked. It didn't destroy you outright. It just made it impossible for you to keep moving forward. Isaiah sat in his dorm that night, staring at the rejection letter. The weight of it settling over him. He could leave. Walk away from this fight. Find another path. But that wasn't who he was. He had fought too hard. For himself. For every young pilot who would come after him. So he made a decision. If they weren't going to let him fly, he was going to take the sky anyway. By any means necessary. And the storm he was about to bring? They would never be ready for it. Isaiah Walker sat in the dim glow of his dorm room. The rejection letter crumpled in his fist. He had seen this play before. The way the system never denied you outright. Just made the path too difficult to walk. They didn't have to tell him no. They just took away the runway, forcing him to crash before he ever had the chance to take off. He had spent his whole life preparing for turbulence. But this was sabotage. And he had a choice to make. The trap of defeat. They wanted him to quit. That was how it worked. They wanted him to get tired. Tired of the extra scrutiny. The quiet but deliberate shut doors. The exhaustion of always having to be better just to be seen as enough. They wanted him to walk away himself so they could pretend it had never been about race. Never about bias. Never about anything other than merit. He could hear the whispers in the hallways already. Guess he just wasn't cut out for it. It's a tough field. Some people just don't have the instincts. Shame. Really. He had potential. They would frame it as his failure. Not theirs. And if Isaiah let that happen, if he let them write his story for him, then every kid who came after him, every young black pilot who dreamed of the sky, would inherit the same impossible fight. And he wasn't about to let that happen. The unseen battlefield. The hardest battles were never fought in the air. They were fought in boardrooms. In whispered meetings. In the invisible places where decisions were made before you even knew they had been decided. Isaiah understood now. This wasn't about his skills. This wasn't about his training. This was about power. And the unspoken rule of the world had always been that men like him did not get to have it. They could admire his talent. They could use his image when they needed diversity. They could let him play the game. So long as he never tried to win it. But Isaiah had spent too much time in the cockpit to be afraid of altitude. He was done playing by their rules. The plan. If they were going to block his path forward, he was going to make another one. He started researching civil aviation programs, international opportunities, independent flight schools. If the doors in America were shutting, maybe there were others, ones they couldn't control. He reached out to pilots he had met at the National Aviation Competition. Some of them had connections outside the country. One had trained in Canada, another in Europe. And then, there was an email, one that changed everything. It was from a retired Air Force pilot who had seen Isaiah's competition performance. A man who had spent his own career watching talented black pilots get shut out of opportunities they had earned. "I saw what they did to you." The email read, "I've seen it happen before. If you're still serious about flying, meet me at this address." Attached was the name of a private airfield. Isaiah stared at the screen. A way forward. A chance. But nothing came without a cost. The risk. He had a scholarship tied to the flight academy. If he pursued outside training, he risked everything. The academy could cut him off. He could lose his connections, his credibility. And if this failed, If this was all a dead end, there would be no coming back. But Isaiah knew something about risk. Flying wasn't about certainty. It was about trusting yourself in the air, even when everything told you to panic. It was about knowing when to pull back and when to push forward. So Isaiah pushed forward. The new path. The airfield was nothing like the academy. It was small, private, the kind of place where planes were built, not just flown. And the man who had invited him? Colonel Thomas Reed. A man whose hands were worn from decades of flying, whose eyes had seen too much, who carried the same exhaustion Isaiah had felt in his bones. Reed didn't waste time. You want to fly? He asked. Or do you just want permission? Isaiah squared his shoulders. I want to fly. Reed studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's get to work. The real training begins. This wasn't like the flight academy. There were no simulations here. No instructors waiting for him to fail. Just real planes, real conditions, real challenges. Reed didn't go easy on him. You think you're good? He barked during one of their first flights together. Good isn't enough. You want to sit in the left seat? You need to be undeniable. Isaiah learned faster than ever. Emergency landings in crosswinds. Navigation with no working instruments. Dead stick landings with no engine power at all. This was the kind of training most cadets never got. And as the months passed, Isaiah knew he was becoming something more than just a pilot. He was becoming a force they could no longer ignore. The return. 6 months later, Isaiah walked back into the academy. Not as a student, but as a pilot with more experience than half of their so-called elite trainees. He had logged more flight hours than anyone in his class. Had trained under a man whose name still carried weight in the industry. And now, when they looked at him, they could no longer pretend he was just potential. Now, they had to see him as what he had always been. A pilot, a leader, a man they could not stop. The storm they never saw coming. Isaiah sat across from Captain Jacobs one last time. Jacobs, who had once told him to wait his turn. Jacobs, who had tried to nudge him into anything but the cockpit. Jacobs, who now had no choice but to acknowledge him. You went around us, Jacobs said, his voice tight. Isaiah smiled. No, he said. I went above you. Jacobs exhaled. You're making enemies, Walker. Isaiah leaned forward. Good, he said, because the sky was never yours to give. And with that, he walked out, ready for takeoff, ready for the fight ahead. And this time, nothing was going to bring him down. Isaiah Walker had always known that some victories came with consequences. The moment he stepped back into the flight academy, he could feel the shift in the air. They weren't just watching him now. They were waiting for him to stumble, waiting for him to make one mistake, waiting for an excuse to say, see, we were right about him all along. But Isaiah had spent his whole life flying against the wind. And he wasn't about to let them drag him back to the ground. The promotion that never came. Pilots were promoted based on skill, flight hours, and leadership ability. By every metric, Isaiah should have been next in line for the captain's seat. But when the assignments were posted, his name wasn't there. Again. Instead, they had given the position to David Calloway, a pilot with fewer flight hours, less simulator experience, and no emergency landings under his belt. Calloway was a good pilot. But Isaiah was better. And everyone knew it. The whispers started immediately. They couldn't really give it to Walker. Could they? He's talented, sure, but leadership? I don't know, man. It's just politics. Too much attention on him right now. Isaiah felt the anger rise. Sharp and bitter. This wasn't about ability. It never had been. It was about power. About who was allowed to have it. About who they trusted to wear the captain's stripes and who they saw as a risk. So Isaiah did what he always did. He worked harder, pushed himself further, made sure there wasn't a single mistake they could use against him. He knew what was coming. The setup. It happened 2 weeks later. A routine cross-country flight. Simple, clean, the kind of flight pilots used to build hours, not to test their skills. Isaiah was assigned as co-pilot. Captain Calloway was in command. The first hour was smooth. Clear skies, perfect visibility. Then came the turbulence. A storm front moved in. Fast and aggressive. The plane rocked. Passengers gasping as seatbelt signs flashed. Isaiah scanned the instruments. The plane was still stable. But they needed to adjust their altitude fast. He turned to Calloway. We need to drop to 30.000 feet. Get under the worst of it. Calloway hesitated. We're fine, he said, gripping the controls tighter. Isaiah frowned. David, the wind shear's shifting. If we stay at this level, we risk. Quote. I said we're fine. Calloway snapped. Isaiah went silent. Because now he understood. This wasn't just a flight. This was a test. Calloway had been put in charge. But the real challenge wasn't the storm outside. It was Isaiah's reaction. If he pushed back too hard. If he questioned Calloway's authority. It wouldn't matter that he was right. They would call him insubordinate. They would say he had a problem with leadership. That he didn't know how to take orders. So Isaiah waited. Watched the instruments. Watched the storm. And the moment the turbulence hit. Harder than expected. Harder than it needed to be. He saw Calloway's hands tighten on the controls. The panic flashing in his eyes. Isaiah acted before the man could stop him. Reached for the altitude controls. Dropped them to 30.000 feet. Just in time. The wind shear passed. The plane stabilized. Passengers sighed in relief. And Calloway? He turned to Isaiah. Face pale. Jaw clenched. You overstepped. He hissed. Isaiah met his gaze. You hesitated. The aftermath. When they landed, there was a formal complaint waiting for Isaiah. Filed by Calloway. The charge? Failure to respect the chain of command. Isaiah should have seen it coming. It didn't matter that he had saved the flight. Didn't matter that passengers had walked off that plane safely because of his decision. The system was never going to reward him for doing the right thing. It was going to punish him for making the wrong person look weak. And as he sat in the debriefing room, waiting for the disciplinary board to decide his future, he realized something. He could play this game forever. Could keep proving himself over and over. And they would still find ways to keep him grounded. Or he could stop asking for permission. Because Isaiah Walker had spent too much of his life fighting for a seat they never intended to give him. It was time to take the cockpit. One way or another. And when he did, they would never be able to bring him down again. Isaiah Walker sat in the hearing room. The walls pressing in around him like a cell. Across the table sat the disciplinary board. 3 senior pilots. Men who had flown for decades but had never seen the world through his eyes. They weren't here for justice. They were here for order. Their order. The kind that kept men like him in their place. Captain Calloway's complaint lay on the table between them. A single sheet of paper that reduced everything Isaiah had done. The decision that saved 200 lives. To one damning phrase. Failure to respect the chain of command. The lead officer cleared his throat. Mr. Walker, do you understand the severity of this charge? Isaiah didn't blink. I understand the severity of letting the wrong man stay in control of that plane. A pause. The man's jaw tightened. Isaiah knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to apologize. He was supposed to back down. He was supposed to make them comfortable again. But he was done playing by their rules. The sentence. The verdict came quick. Isaiah was suspended indefinitely. Not fired. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they were leaving him in limbo. Stripping him of his flight hours. His training. His momentum. Forcing him to wait. Forcing him to break. And when they told him. When they said it with that measured, bureaucratic calm, he realized something. They thought they had won. Because they still believed that power belonged to them. That they could give it. That they could take it away. But Isaiah Walker had never been the kind of man to wait for permission. So when they told him to go home, to think about his future, he simply nodded. And then he walked out the door. The next move. He didn't go home. He went to the airfield. To Colonel Thomas Reed. The old pilot took one look at him and grunted. They finally came for you. Huh? Isaiah exhaled. Yeah. Reed nodded. Like he had seen this happen before. Because he had. Good. Reed said. Means you were doing something right. Isaiah stared at him. You don't sound surprised. Reed chuckled. Kid, You're fighting a system that was built long before you ever sat in a cockpit. You thought they were just gonna let you walk into that left seat? Isaiah clenched his jaw. I don't need their permission. Reed's eyes sharpened. Then let's get you flying. The underground sky. Reed introduced Isaiah to a network he never knew existed. Pilots who had been pushed out, shut down, denied their rightful place in the sky. Men and women who had refused to stop flying. They worked in private aviation, in freight transport, in international airspace where the rules were different. And they weren't waiting for anyone's approval. Isaiah trained harder than ever. He flew in regulated night flights, handling cargo planes through rough weather without the safety net of commercial regulations. He took dangerous, high-risk emergency routes, delivering supplies to places no commercial airline would go. And all the while, he built his reputation, the kind that no institution could erase, the kind that spread outside their system. And when people needed a pilot, someone they could trust, someone they could call when no one else would take the job. They are called Isaiah Walker. The day they came back. It took 2 years. 2 years of flying outside their walls. 2 years of building his own damn name. And then one day, the very people who had shut him out, the airline executives, the industry gatekeepers, the men who had told him he didn't belong, came looking for him, because their system had finally caught up to the truth. And the truth was? They needed him more than he had ever needed them. The offer. A formal letter. A request to meet. An offer to return. Isaiah sat across from the same board that had once suspended him, watching as they tried to smooth over the past. It seems there was some misunderstanding regarding your leadership abilities. One of the men said. We believe your experience, both here and abroad, has shaped you into the kind of captain we need. Another added. Captain. Not co-pilot. Captain. The left seat. The thing they had tried so hard to keep from him. They had finally seen the truth. He was undeniable. And now? Now they were offering him the very thing they had spent years saying he wasn't ready for. Isaiah let the silence stretch. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one waiting. They were. Finally, he leaned forward, folding his hands together. I have one condition. The lead officer blinked. And what's that? Isaiah's voice was steady. You open your doors to more pilots like me. The room tensed. Because they knew what he meant. No more invisible barriers. No more quiet, unspoken rules that kept men like him out. No more waiting. The men at the table exchanged glances. Because they had no choice. Because he had forced their hand. And finally, they nodded. Welcome aboard, Captain Walker. The sky belongs to everyone. Isaiah took the left seat for the first time weeks later. The uniform fits differently now. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The sky had never belonged to them. They had just been keeping it for themselves. But not anymore. Not ever again. Because Isaiah Walker had proven something they could never erase. The sky does not belong to those who build walls. It belongs to those who have the strength to fly through them. And as he guided his plane down the runway, preparing for takeoff, he smiled. Because this time, there was nothing left to hold him down.